Hello, ladies and gents. This is a continuation of the World War II notes. We're going to pick up right where we left off last time. At the end of the last notes, we talked about the U.S. entry into the war as a result of Pearl Harbor, right, and FDR signing the war declaration. That's right about where we left off at the end of this. So picking up today with the next section, if you're following along, this is right about where you want to be. The section on fighting the war, we're going to click through pretty quickly, even more quickly than we usually do. Largely because, as with all of the wars, the College Board curriculum doesn't tend to focus a tremendous amount on like the troop movement or, the size of the battles or exactly which, troops are on the left flank and, which area, that type of stuff is less important. More so they look at causes, they look at effects, and they look at turning points. So we're going to talk a little generally about the war itself. I'm going to kind of pass some things, and we'll talk about the turning points both in the Pacific and in the European front as well. Key thing that you need to know about the fighting of World War II, and that is maybe obvious to some of you or maybe not obvious to others of you, and that is that in many ways for the United States, World War II is actually really almost two separate wars that we just happen to be fighting at the same time, kind of in parallel, rather than being one concerted effort. So we have this two-front war, right? We're fighting one war in Germany, in Europe against Germany, and the European front is a massive allied effort where we're fighting very closely with British troops and eventually with French troops after D-Day, and it's a ground-based war, aerial bombing troops. It's sort of more like standard military type stuff. In the Pacific, however, the war that we're going to fight in the Pacific is much more naval-based. It's mostly Navy and Marines, and it is largely driven by the United States. Our biggest ally in the Pacific is actually going to be Australia. Down here, they're going to contribute quite a bit to the war effort, and the British there's several British aircraft carriers and things like that participate as well. So it's not that we're alone in the Pacific necessarily, but the Pacific is much more our fight, and we are going to see more of an American sort of led dominance there, whereas the European fight is much more coalition based. If you listen to veterans from World War II talk about their experiences, it sounds very different if you're talking to a veteran who fought in the Pacific versus a veteran who fought in Europe. The European veteran stories sound a lot like World War I or sort of other that type of traditional warfare. Pacific veterans stories often sound really more like Vietnam. It's just a very different vibe to the wars themselves, even though they're happening simultaneously. We're going to look at Europe first, largely because Churchill and FDR together decide that the European front is more crucial, that it's threatening more, threatening the Allies more, that there's a greater chance of invasion, I guess you could say, from Germany than from the Japanese. So it's not to say that the Pacific was being ignored. The United States sends troops out into the Pacific within a couple of days of the attack at Pearl Harbor. So there's some attempts by a couple of Marine squadrons to push back in the Pacific. So it's not that we're ignoring that at all, but the bulk of the Allied effort is definitely going to be in Europe first. And so you take a look at the map that's on here right now. This is Europe when the U.S. enters. All of the stuff in red is controlled by Germany or German allies, German-controlled territory. All the stuff in blue is Allied-controlled. So, of course, we're mostly in the United Kingdom and Soviet Russia. I mentioned in the last note set that this area over here, the Eastern Front between Germany and the Soviet Union, is where some of the biggest atrocities of the war are taking place. There's relatively little American action over there, so we're not going to be talking about that quite as much. Primarily what the Americans do, and there's a lot more to this, obviously, but the 5-second version is basically that we're going to start our campaign down here in northern Africa, trying to push the German and Italian troops that have conquered large chunks of northern Africa out to give us a foothold down here. The idea is that we want to attack Germany from the south. They call it the soft underbelly of Germany because Germany is less protected along its border with Italy because, of course, Italy is a long-standing ally. So in 1942, most of our efforts are centered around trying to gain a foothold down here. This is the whole, like, Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, and, like, Dwight D. Eisenhower. That's where all this is taking place. And then by 1943, we've started to try to take Sicily, and we're going to start to try to fight our way kind of up the calf of the Italian boot, as it were. And so that's the big thing that's going on. The turning point in Europe is going to come in June of 1944 with what we usually refer to as the D-Day invasion. Operation Overlord is the actual correct code name for this. This was the attempt by the Allies to liberate France, secretly or surprisingly, with a shock invasion, and to try to return it to its free status, not a German puppet state anymore, but instead a fully functioning member of the Allied alliance. The general in charge of the D-Day invasion is Dwight Eisenhower. This is what's going to make him, he's already a very well-known general, but this is what's going to make him famous enough to become president pretty easily in the 1950s. So it's a pretty big deal there. It's a really intense morning attack. The soldiers pile out of troop ships in the water and have to make their way across the beach and up to the cliffs here, which of course are very heavily occupied by German machine gun nests. There's a tremendous amount of lives lost in the assault on the various beaches. You can see the numbers, the troop strength numbers down there at the bottom. And it takes about 3 weeks or so, but it is going to be a successful invasion. And so by the time that we hit, that was June of 1944, by the time we hit the end of June or early July, France is once again in Allied control. We have American soldiers marching through Paris, largely greeted happily by the Parisians and by the French in general. And Germany is now no longer able to continue like the Blitz or to continue any sort of extended bombing raids out into Great Britain or into the Allied area. That's a really big deal. We, however, having gained France back, are now able to really step up our bombing campaigns against Germany. So we're going to see several German cities are bombed really intensely. Dresden, in particular, is one that just gets firebombed almost into smithereens. This is right around the same time that we invent the firebomb technique of napalm, which is like a sticky, like gel, sticky inflammatory, it's almost like sticky gasoline basically. So you drop a bomb filled with napalm, it explodes, it flings gobs of napalm all over the place, and it catches things on fire and starts these big raging fires. It's very destructive. We're going to use it a lot during Vietnam as well. The last German offensive of the war is called the Battle of the Bulge. It's French troops actually going to take a big hit here as well, but American troops also. This is the last time that Germany is able to try to push back and regain some territory. It's a hard-fought battle, long-fought battle, but it is eventually a victory for the Allies. And so from January of 1945 until the end of the war in Europe, which is in May of 1945. So for the next few months, the story of the war is basically one of Germany sort of retreating into here's Berlin right here. And what you have is you have the Soviets who have managed to push back the German efforts over here and have swept through kind of what used to be Poland and are moving inward on Berlin from this direction. And then the Allies, the United States and Allied troops are still making their way up through Italy going to take Rome eventually. And then we have conquered France, so we're also kind of coming in from this direction. So we're surrounding Germany from three sides and pressing inward closer and closer and closer and closer into the city of Berlin, right, which is where the high command has retreated to. Right while this is going on, so just about a month or so after the Battle of the Bulge, we have the first one, well, it's not the first, but the first one that you need to know a little bit about. World War II ends in a little bit of a weird way. There's not a treaty that ends World War II, like there's no Treaty of Versailles or Treaty of Paris or anything like that. What we have instead are a series of during-war and post-war conferences where the Allied forces are going to meet to determine. A lot of the early ones have to do with, what are we going to do next, sort of how's the war going to progress. And then as we get into kind of the middle years of the war, they start to deal more with what's going to happen in Europe afterwards. And so Yalta is a pretty important one. It's the last time that the big three are going to be in charge of things. So that's Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt. And what they decide, two things are going to be really important for kind of the post-World War II period. So next unit, when we start to talk about the Cold War and how that develops, we're going to be kind of coming back to some of this Yalta stuff. The first thing they decide is that Germany is going to be divided into 4 occupation zones, and that each ally will control part of Germany. So the United States will have part of Germany, and France and Great Britain, and then the Soviet Union. And this is how we're going to eventually wind up with East and West Germany splitting into separate countries. So that's important there. And then the thing you see at the bottom there, this idea that if we look at where the Soviet Union is coming in sort of through Poland, so they control Poland, like they're occupying it, and the question is, okay, what are they going to do with Poland? And the Stalin very much wants to keep Poland, and the Allies, Churchill and FDR kind of, they kind of acquiesce to the Soviet Union keeping Poland, but they make him promise to hold free elections that to allow the people of Poland some role in determining their government. And they're going to sort of nominally uphold this, but not really. Obviously, Poland's not going to hold. Poland is not going to hold free elections after the war, and that's going to be one of the things that will cause the run up to the Cold War. So we talk about why are the Soviet Union and the United States? Why are we upset at each other? What are the things that cause the beginnings of Cold War tensions? One of these is going to be this issue of elections in Poland. So those are important because we'll be kind of coming back to them. Roosevelt dies not that long after the Yalta Conference. The sudden and surprising death. He has a cerebral hemorrhage, excuse me. And the guy who takes over for him is Harry Truman, vice president. He's only been vice president for like a month at this point. Roosevelt was re-inaugurated for his historic fourth term in March of 1945. We used to inaugurate presidents in March. And so when he dies on April 12th, the new Vice President Truman has only been vice president for a very little amount of time. Had been a senator from Missouri before this. So Truman's going to be left to run kind of a lot of the latter part of the war and make a lot of the last decisions, including eventually the dropping of the atomic bomb. So FDR dies on April 12th. It's sort of a sad timing to me because he had been so much at the forefront of kind of pushing to see the destruction of the Nazi regime and of Hitler, and it's only a few weeks later that happens. The Nazi high command has retreated to an underground bunker under the city of Berlin. Hand-to-hand fighting and combat is occurring in the city above him. In the last week of April, the Soviets enter the city and start to, fight against the various Nazi and SS battalions that are in control of the city itself. And finally, on April 30th, Hitler is going to, he marries his longtime girlfriend, that's Eva Braun, that's her right there. They're going to get married on like the 27th or the 28th, and then together they commit suicide on the 30th. We didn't know a lot about this for a long time because the Soviet troops are the first ones to find the bunker. This picture right here is something that actually didn't get released until the 1990s with the fall of the Soviet Union. So we actually didn't know very much about what happened, but the evidence suggests most likely that Eva Braun bit down on a cyanide capsule, and that Hitler bit down on a cyanide capsule and shot himself, and that they then had people take their bodies out and burn them so that the bodies couldn't be found or used or displayed in any way. Partially this was because Mussolini, the leader of Italy, had been killed a couple of days earlier, and his body had been like stripped naked and hung in the square with like people throwing fruit at him and like kicking him and stuff, very sort of disrespecting of the body itself. And Hitler really didn't want to see that happen to himself. It's going to take a little while for the Germans to kind of figure out what their new government is up to and surrender, but this is really the end of the war itself. As the Soviet and U.S. Allied troops move in on Germany, this is when we really start to become aware of like the horrors of the Holocaust itself. We knew that the camps existed, but we didn't really know the degree to which a lot of them were operating the death camps like Auschwitz and some of the others. And so this is really when news of the Holocaust starts to spread outside of Germany and starts to become aware of the just sheer awful enormity of the tragedy, of the atrocity, the evil. And this is when we start to hear a lot of talk of war crime trials, which we'll talk a little bit more about towards the end of that. So May 9th is the official Victory in Europe Day. They call it VE Day. Celebrations ring out across the Allied world, especially in Great Britain, which stood alone against Germany for so long. So May 9th, 1945 is the end of the war in Europe. Yay, hooray, big celebrations, except, of course, that we are still at war with Japan. So switch our focus here. Right after Pearl Harbor, so like immediately after Pearl Harbor, like the very next day, the Japanese army, taking advantage of their strike, are going to sweep out and take over most of everything that you see inside of this red line. So the red line represents kind of, the greatest extent of the Japanese possessions in the Pacific. So they're going to sweep into the Philippines, which of course are controlled by the U.S., and there's a U.S. troops there that are going to fight back for a little while, although they're mostly outnumbered. The guy who's in charge of the U.S. troops in the Philippines is General Douglas MacArthur. He has to leave after about 2 weeks of pretty heavy fighting. He very famously vows, "I shall return," and he's going to spend most of the rest of the war trying to make good on that promise. There's also a couple of early fights, like I mentioned. The Marines are going to have some early battles in kind of like the Guadalcanal region, like on the Solomon Islands, kind of right like north of Australia. That's where some of the earliest U.S. battles of the Pacific theater are. This is Americans leave the Philippines and leave behind them a lot of Filipino allies who are treated really horribly by the Japanese. This is what's called the Bataan Death March. It's going to become a pretty famous wartime atrocity. They round up pretty much everybody who had any association with the American Army, some Americans, mostly Filipino allies, and they're going to march them very cruelly across the island towards Bataan, where there was a war camp, a prisoner of war camp set up, and just people slaughtered and killed really brutally, about 10,000 killed on the march itself. The turning point in the Pacific comes a little earlier than the turning point in Europe, and it comes in a battle called the Battle of Midway. D-Day and Midway are probably the two main battles that you need to know by name. Midway is this kind of lump of rock that's like midway in the Pacific Ocean between North America and between Asia. And it's just primarily a naval battle, aerial battle. It engages the aircraft carriers, Japanese and American aircraft carriers for the first time, and it's going to destroy one of the big aircraft carriers that the Japanese had, and they didn't have very many. As a side note, at the Battle of Midway, the Japanese lost a tremendous amount of pilots, as many pilots as they produced in an entire year in training. So it's a really big blow just sort of numerically to the Japanese military, which is very built up, but doesn't have a very good system for like replacing men as they fall, unlike the United States, which does that pretty well. And so this is June of 1942, right? We're still going to be fighting for more than 3 more years. It's like three years plus a few more months before the end of the war. But from here on out, before June of 1942, the Japanese are mostly advancing, right? The general direction of the war is the Japanese are advancing towards the United States. After Midway, from here on out, the entire rest of the war, you can see that that's the farthest extent of the Japanese advance, right? It stops right before Midway. So for the rest of the war, it's just going to be a slow crawl of the United States and our allies back in towards Japan. And we're going to start this, this strategy called island hopping, where we fight a series of small battles. You can kind of see the blue lines of the Allied defense from island to island, kind of coming at Japan from underneath. To make sure that we don't get flanked and that we have like a base to work from. There's sort of 2 pushes on the Allied offensive. One is really to take back the Philippines. You can see that one kind of down there at the bottom. And the other, of course, is to gain us some sort of airfield close enough to Japan that we can feasibly stage a raid, an invasion of mainland Japan. And so if you look at like the majority of American deaths and things like that in the Pacific, it's these island hopping battles. It sounds very like, I don't know, kind of small and cute, like island hopping. Oh, we hop from battle to battle, but they are really intense, hand-to-hand, like jungle fighting, in tropical climates that our troops are very much not used to and not trained for, against people who know the land very intimately and are very dug in. And they're real, like, brutal. And again, it has a very Vietnam feel to it. A lot of these battles, like Peleliu in particular, is very bad. By October 1944, the island hopping strategy has taken us back to the Philippines, right, about a little over 2 years after we got pushed out. And so this is MacArthur very triumphantly and very dramatically returning to the Philippines. He was definitely a little bit of a drama queen, MacArthur was. That's him right there in the center. There's about 3-week battle of the Philippines that's going to take out pretty much what remains of the Japanese ability to, like this, the last remaining Japanese aircraft carrier basically is going to be almost completely destroyed. And they lose largely their remaining like experienced and able flyers. And so it's from here on out, from October 1944 is the first time that we're going to see kamikaze used. And from here for about the next year or so, of the remaining year or so of the war, then we're going to see this kamikaze attempt. Kamikaze pilots are suicide bombing pilots whose goal is to use their plane as a large and aimable bomb to try to take out like valuable Allied assets like destroyers or aircraft carriers, those types of things. And they're very effective at first when they first start, because we don't really know how to deal with them. We're just taken by surprise. But we do figure out how to deal with them relatively quickly, within about a month or 2, and then they become much less effective in terms of being able to sink, U.S. ships and things of that nature. But they do suggest one of the problems that the United States faces as we approach the end of the war, and that is a concern that there's a very strong social and cultural expectation in Japan that people, the Japanese citizens, be willing to sort of die for their country. Obviously, not every single person feels strongly about this, but death rather than surrender is a sort of culturally resonant and culturally valuable thing for a lot of people in many Eastern societies, and especially in Japan in this time period. So there's a concern about how badly a land invasion would hurt U.S. troops. The last 2 major battles in the Pacific, names that you've probably heard before because they are very well-known battles, are Okinawa and Iwo Jima, right there. You can see them in February and March, and then in April and June over in Okinawa. And if you look at where these 2 are, I think you can pretty intuitively guess why we wanted those 2, why we fought very long and hard in both cases for those, largely because they allow us to, they're large-ish islands that are occupied and that have enough space for us to use them as bases for aerial raids, bombing raids, and then eventually a potential staged land invasion. Iwo Jima in particular, if you look at where Iwo Jima is, puts us in a direct line to Tokyo, to the capital, and that's going to allow us, once we gain control of it to stage bombing raids. This Battle of Iwo Jima is also a fairly major turning point, and it's the site of this extremely famous picture of a bunch of Marines hoisting the American flag at the top of Mount Suribachi, which is the central mountain in Iwo Jima. It was actually on the first day of the battle. The battle continued for like another month after that very famous and heroic picture is taken. But that's Iwo Jima. For most of the month of February, the battle is being fought. So what we're going to decide to do after Iwo Jima and Okinawa are won, so this is like sort of spring of 1945, we're going to decide to engage on really, really heavy firebombing, right as just we had done to Germany in the last months of that factor of the war. We're going to start firebombing various civilian targets in Japan very heavily. Tokyo in particular, the capital city, is going to get just pounded. A lot of the buildings are, made of paper, very thin woods, right? They're very flammable. Probably close to 200,000 civilian deaths, and that's just in Tokyo. That doesn't include all of the other many raids that we do outside of there in the last months of the war. So just a real punishing series of bombing raids. This is, of course, right around when FDR dies, and we're just getting ready to sort of wrap the war up in Europe as that happens. And so Truman is at a conference. He's actually at the Potsdam Conference a few months after he becomes president, when he is made aware of the fact that the United States has an active and a viable weapon. This is the second of the two big wartime conferences that you need to know something about. We talked about Yalta earlier, and here's Potsdam. At Potsdam, we have sort of a new big three. We still have Stalin. Truman has replaced Roosevelt, and then wartime Prime Minister of Great Britain, Winston Churchill, has actually gotten voted out of office and been replaced by a guy named Clement Attlee, who's otherwise not terribly important. So it's at the Potsdam Conference that we're going to do a lot of, this is after Germany has surrendered, right? So we do a lot of finalization of some of the post-war boundaries of Europe. And they also make a very important statement of unconditional surrender for Japan. There were a lot of facets inside of the Japanese government who might have been willing to surrender conditionally. So to say, well, we'll surrender on the condition that we get to keep our emperor, or whatever other variety of conditions there were. But Truman and Attlee and the Chinese, who I'm completely blanking on, the head of the Chinese government, all decide together that they will only accept unconditional surrender from Japan. Soviet Union, it's worth noting, as the slide mentions, is still not at war with Japan at this point. There's an agreement that they will enter war soon, and that's one of the reasons why Truman and the U.S. government want to hasten the end of the war in Japan, is because they don't want already sort of the whole communist Cold War tensions have kind of begun, and they don't want the Soviet Union to be involved in an invasion of Japan because they don't want Japan to become communist. So there's an incentive to us to end the war before the Soviet Union joins. So Truman finds out that we have successfully exploded a test atomic weapon in the New Mexico desert. It's called the Trinity Test. It's July 1945. It's the first successful nuclear explosion detonated by the United States. And that we have a couple more bombs, essentially, that we're ready to deploy. We're still firebombing, so traditional bombing, right, Tokyo very heavily. But this Manhattan Project, headed by lead scientist J. Robert Oppenheimer, has been taking place secretly in the New Mexico desert since right about the beginning of the war. It was so top secret that Truman himself didn't even know about it until after FDR died and he became president. And so the question that Truman is left with here in fairly short order is basically, do we use these bombs, which we don't really know that much about, right? We've only detonated one in test practice. We don't really have an idea of what the scope is going to be or how this is going to impact things. We're pretty sure it's going to make a big explosion, but we don't really know how big or how impactful. Or do we continue to try with sort of more traditional warfare? Do we continue to try firebombing raids? Do we prepare for a land invasion, etc.? So Truman decides to go for shock and awe. They are going to commission one plane. It's called the Enola Gay, pilot Paul Tibbets, that you can see up there at the top, on August 6th of 1945 to leave with the first one of the two bombs from the islands down here, Tinian, and to fly to Iwo Jima. Right, to make a single loop, basically, over Iwo Jima. A couple days later, the second bomb is going to be dropped on the city of Nagasaki. It was actually aimed at, if you take a look at this map here, you can see that the original target was supposed to be Kokura, but there was a lot of fog over Kokura that day, so they defected to the secondary target, Nagasaki. And in the bombings themselves, is a very dramatic immediate death toll. One single bomb in Hiroshima kills about 70,000 people immediately. So when you look at this image, or when you look at video footage of the dropping of atomic bombs, you're looking at 70,000 people dying in that instant as the bomb explodes. And then just a tremendous amount of long-term effects that we really certainly didn't anticipate. It's worth noting, if you've ever wondered why we chose these two kind of mid-sized cities that don't really have any particular military, kind of like some military ties, but not really. So like there's major centers or anything like that. It's because we were looking for cities that hadn't already been firebombed very extensively. Like, why don't we drop the atomic bomb on Tokyo? Because Tokyo is pretty well destroyed already, and we really want to see what these things can do. And that's not me being flippant. That is genuinely one of the motives behind choosing these cities as targets, is that we wanted a relatively pristine target so that we could correctly evaluate the extent of the damage caused by these atomic bombs. That's Hiroshima after the first bomb. The bombings are effective, although it takes a little while. Your textbook goes into some more detail about how that plays out. But September 2nd, 1945 is the official signing of the surrender by the nation of Japan, unconditional surrender, and the very famous VJ Day and the end of the war. So the war started September 1st, 1939, with the German invasion of Poland, and ended September 2nd, 1945, almost exactly 6 years later, with the signing of the surrender of Japan after the dropping of 2 atomic bombs. So that's basically the scope of World War II. Again, that's World War II in like 20 minutes. You could spend an entire college class on it. There's obviously quite a bit more to it than that, but that's about as much as you need to know to have kind of a basic understanding of what's going on with the war. The Comms Board would like you to know, this is actually directly out of the curriculum, so this is an important point to slow down on a little here, that reasons why the Allies win World War II. A couple things. Number one, despite some pretty serious differences, especially with the USSR, there's a very effective political and military cooperation between the 3 major Allied nations, and eventually 4 when France comes back on board. In addition, Germany and Japan both have industrial booms like before the war, but once the war starts up, they're not able to keep pace with the production of war materials. They're just more isolated. They don't really have the size or the raw materials that the United States has. And so by the time we're really underway, we're producing like a major naval ship. So something like 3 or 4 days to produce a ship. That same ship would take, a month and a half to produce under more normal industrial conditions like those that you see in Germany and Japan. So we're just able to like replace damaged or destroyed war assets and to make and supply our allies with just a vast array more technology than the countries we're fighting have. We also keep up a pretty impressive pace of like technological and scientific advances. I already mentioned, obviously, the atomic bomb would be a good example of this, but sonar and radar are both developed in the middle of the war by scientists working for the United States. Those are obviously enormously important, especially in terms of combating sonar, in terms of combating submarines, U-boats. So those are huge. And then just in general, there's a really strong current of popular support in the United States, in Great Britain, in France, for the idea of fighting against fascism. Even today, I think people tend to look back at World War II as like a good war or a just war, a war that's valid and that was fought for valid causes or valid reasons. That's something that we're not going to see with some of our later wars, like Vietnam, for example. But it is very, very crucial, this sort of home front support of the war, very important to the winning of the victory. Speaking of the home front, next little section of the notes here is going to deal with the United States at war. This is pretty important. The College Board likes a lot for you to know how various wars, big ones, especially like the Civil War, impact people at home. Luckily for us, a lot of it is really similar to what we saw with World War I. So all of the things that we talked about happening on the home front in World War I also happened in World War II, just usually like longer and more. So we had government control of industry in World War I. We have it in World War II also, but longer and more. So in particular, what the U.S. government's trying really hard to do is make sure that we don't see a lot of inflation or like price gouging, so people charging too much for like black market goods, etc. They're fairly effective at that. Taxes go up in both wars. They really actually go up a fair amount during World War II. This is really when the income tax system starts to impact a lot more people. Our middle class has been growing, and people are moving more into the middle class. They expand the tax brackets a good bit during World War II, so that's a big deal. We're drafting again. That Selective Service Act, we saw one in World War I. We see this one in World War II. It's actually the one that's still in effect today. Ever since 1940, we've had a continual draft, so that's important. We're going to be rationing. just real quick, like clicking there. Same thing we saw during World War I, except again, legalized. You would get these books of ration stamps, and so you'd go to buy, this one's for fuel oil, or you get them for sugar or whatever, and you'd go to buy your good, you'd have to give up that, you'd give up your money, right, however much it costs, and then you'd also have to tear off stamps for however much you were buying. And when you ran out of stamps, no matter how much money you had, the idea was that you couldn't buy any more of the goods, so they're trying to limit that as well. We're going to talk a little more about increased roles for minorities and things of that nature, but it's worth noting that we're not quite as effective as we were in World War I at keeping strikes from happening. Again, largely just because the war lasts for so much longer. We were only in World War I for like a year. But we do support a no strike pledge, and strikes do go down a lot. There's not nearly as many as we usually see. One of the big propaganda messages of World War II, kind of ties into what I was just talking about with why the Allies win, is this idea that we're fighting a war for democracy. And FDR in 1941, before the U.S. actually joined the war, gave this very famous speech called the Four Freedoms speech that sort of sums this idea up, that we are sort of fighting on behalf of democracy. It takes that rhetoric that Wilson used in World War I, right? It's a war, to make the world safe for democracy, that whole thing that Wilson said when we entered World War I. It takes that and it extends it further, that we're fighting for sort of like civil rights, almost universal civil rights for people in other countries, that we're fighting for freedom of worship everywhere around the world, freedom of speech everywhere around the world, freedom from want, freedom from fear, that these become kind of, I don't know, almost like a promise of the United States. It's part of what's going to lead to our eventual increased role in world affairs after the war, and our role in the United Nations and a variety of other groups. So that's important rhetoric. These are very famous propaganda posters that were made off of paintings by Norman Rockwell. Those are very common images during World War II. Good to know. We have a pretty booming Hollywood industry, as we've talked about in some of the other notes. The 1920s and 30s see the rise of kind of golden age Hollywood, and they're going to be very heavily involved between Hollywood stars. This is Clark Gable down here, who was the sort of heartthrob star of like Gone with the Wind and a variety of others who joined the Army. Major League Baseball players like Bob Feller, Ted Williams, right, stop their baseball careers and go and join the military. Lots of films centered around the war themes. Walt Disney starts to make a bunch of cartoons. This is Donald Duck dreaming that he's in Nazi land. It's a very famous cartoon called Der Führer's Face. Actually won an Oscar for Best Original Song in like 1942 or 43. And so a lot of these were produced and then shown as newsreels before a feature. So you'd go and you'd sit down in the theater to see Gone with the Wind or Wizard of Oz or whatever it was, Destination Tokyo. And before, in the same time period when we would normally be seeing like previews today, they would show these newsreels that were kind of curated by the government, video clips and images of the war. Because remember, we don't really have television yet. So if you want to see like live footage of what's going on in the war, it has to be through these newsreels that you see before movies. Now, like I said, they were very heavily controlled by the government, so it wasn't really a real. We weren't seeing like dead bodies or firefights or anything like that. It was very sanitized and very tightly controlled by the government. Pay for the war in mostly the same way that we did during World War I. A really intensive war bond campaign combined with the tax hike that I mentioned. Those are sort of the main strategies that we're going to use effectively to pay for the war. A lot of people on the move. Sort of a second Great Migration, moving people out of rural areas, African Americans and other people as well, and into industrial centers. Atlanta in particular is going to really like boom hardcore on the back of their shipping industry. We invite in with open arms through a program called the Braceros program, Mexican workers. About something like 400,000 a year at the height of the program during the 1940s. This is part of our very, I was going to say schizophrenic, that's maybe a little too strong, but our very conflicting policies that we have on immigration from Mexico. If you remember, during like the 1920s, we were welcoming people in, and then in the 30s, it was a go away. The Depression's on. Here in the 1940s, we're welcoming people back in, and we're going to push people out in the 60s, like just sort of back and forth in the early part of the 20th century. African Americans have a little bit of a mixed wartime experience. I already mentioned when we were talking about the Depression that FDR has kind of a better record in at least sort of working with the African American community, even if not necessarily fighting against segregation in any way. So the main activist name that you need to know and associate with World War II for the Black community is the guy who's on the slide right there. His name is A. Philip Randolph. And he was the head of the largest African American labor union in the country during World War II. It's called the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. It basically did like being a stewardess on a plane, except on trains, is that type of job. And what he threatened to do was something that's going to become kind of a hallmark of the civil rights movement eventually, and that is March on Washington. We've seen this type of thing before from jobless people. Remember Coxey's Army and the Bonus Army March, right? So this is taking that same tactic and turning it for a civil rights purpose. It never actually happens because Roosevelt is going to create the FEPC, the Fair Employment Practices Commission, and pass an executive order that says that if you have a contract with the government, so if you mostly defense contracts is what we're largely talking about, that you can't discriminate based on race in hiring. That's a really huge deal because this is the first time the government's passed any sort of civil rights anything since Reconstruction, right? Since like I think 1876 was the last, no, excuse me, 1874 was the last Reconstruction law to pass through U.S. Congress. And so this is quite a big deal here in 1941. The Black community adopts this slogan they call Double V for Victory. And the idea here is that the Black community will support war against fascism abroad, victory against fascism abroad, but at the same time, they're paralleling that with the fight for a victory over segregation at home. And when the war is over, the Black veterans, men who had been in the military and gone and fought for freedom and liberated Paris, they're going to be at the forefront of a lot of the early civil rights movement. Like in many ways, World War II is a cause of the kind of, nonviolent African American civil rights movement that we see starting in the mid-50s. So like Jackie Robinson, for example, is a World War II veteran. Thurgood Marshall is a World War II veteran. So a lot of that kind of community is going to become really central in the early part of the civil rights movement. There still is a lot of tension, not an overwhelmingly good time in general for any race in the United States, but we see several big race riots. Anytime that you've got a lot of African Americans moving into urban environments and there's conflict over like housing and jobs, those types of things tend to lead to clashes in this time period. So we see a series of riots. There's the ones I have mentioned on. There's a big one in Detroit. There's a whole incident in California surrounding the Port Chicago incident. It's a big explosion that kills a lot of Black sailors in the Navy, and then the subsequent fight for fair working conditions. So that's kind of what's going on in the Black community there. On the other side of the country, we have some continuing issues with our increased Hispanic population, right, as a result of the Bracero program, and then the sailors who are coming out to California towns from all over the country where they're going to be stationed to sail with the Pacific Fleet, right? So we're staging the war out of Los Angeles and out of Santa Barbara and out of Sacramento and San Francisco and all of those kind of California communities that now have these new populations, both of Hispanic immigrants or Hispanic families, and then also of sailors, many of whom are not terribly fond of the Hispanic community. What the young gentleman is wearing in this photo here as he's being inspected by the policeman, this is what's called a zoot suit. It was a style of dress that was really popular and kind of young in ethnic communities, both Black and Hispanic communities in like Harlem and in Detroit and in Chicago and then also in Los Angeles. And it was perceived as unpatriotic because of wartime rationing restrictions on cloth. You weren't supposed to be able to make pants, with more than X amount of fabric or jackets with, excess amount of fabric. So there was this sort of thriving trade of like black market tailors who would still make zoot suits for people. And many of the sailors saw that as unpatriotic, as the slide indicates. And so after a couple of clashes between groups of sailors and groups of Hispanic youths, about 250 sailors get like a fleet of taxi cabs to take them into one of the Hispanic neighborhoods, and they just start to sort of wail on anybody that they see walking by with zoot suits. It's burst of little riots in like late May and then again in early June that really, for the first time, kind of kicks off a sense of like a real activism in the Hispanic community. Forms LULAC down there at the bottom that we note, they're going to be at the forefront of fighting against some of California's racial segregation. Los Angeles has segregated schools for Hispanic and Asian children in like the 1930s and 40s. So we're going to start to see the beginning of some of that activism out of these zoot suit riots. Quick pause. Okay, and we're back for one of the uglier episodes of American wartime treatment of its citizens, and that is the Japanese internment. So what happens is that just about a month and a half after Pearl Harbor, several of the military high command in the U.S. military asked Roosevelt to allow them to do something that he's going to do by creating this Executive Order 9066. It's probably the only executive order that you need to know the number of, good to be able to recognize it. And what it did was it allowed the military to designate any part of the United States as what they call an exclusionary zone, that they can exclude any or all persons that they basically decide to draw that line on. And so they create a couple of these mostly around big naval and army bases, but the biggest one that's created is created along the Pacific coast. I'm going to flip real quick, I'll come back here. If you take a look at this map of the United States, the western part of the United States, this long dark line right here, that was the exclusionary zone. So you can see that it kind of jukes around to contain all of California, a little bit of Arizona, a little bit of Oregon and Washington state. And what they said basically was that any person who was Japanese themselves, so who had immigrated here from Japan, or who was of Japanese descent up to the third generation, have to leave that area. At first, they tell people to leave voluntarily, just to go somewhere else outside of that zone. It becomes very quickly apparent that that's not going to work very well. And so what they're going to do is they're going to round up everybody, winds up being about 120,000 people who live in that zone who are Japanese or of Japanese descent, and they're going to put them in essentially detention centers and then remove them to large-scale internment camps. We've only had immigration to the United States from Japan for a relatively short amount of time. So it's only really about 3 generations of people who live here. You have, in terms of Issei for first generation, Nisei and Sansei for second and third generation. So a little under half, about 48%, are actually people who are from Japan. Born in Japan, moved here at some point. But the majority are second or third generation people who are born here, who are American citizens, right? And therefore, at least theoretically, have all of the rights to due process and to not be arrested without cause, just because they happen to be of, the race or ethnicity of a country that we're fighting against. And so that's obviously where the civil liberties issue falls in here. The main internment camps, Manzanar right here in kind of the center of California, Central Valley, that Manzanar right there, Tule Lake, those are 2 of the bigger ones that might come up that you might need to recognize. There's a very famous book called Farewell to Manzanar that makes Manzanar particularly famous. They're real hastily constructed communities. This is Manzanar. It's all seen from the guard tower. They're in very barren and isolated areas, usually mostly in the desert is where most of them are constructed. The best way I think to describe an internment camp is that they were kind of like minimum security prisons. You were trapped inside. There was, fences. They had barbed wire at the top. There were guards with guns that were pointed in at you to keep you in. You weren't allowed to leave. But it wasn't like the Holocaust, right? You weren't being tortured. You weren't being deliberately starved or, made to submit to medical experimentation or any of those sort of horrific things that we hear coming out of the Holocaust. So it's like you don't want to talk about it necessarily as being the same thing as the Holocaust, but it's also really not okay to just imprison a bunch of people without any sort of due process or trial or even reasonable cause suspicion that they might actually have been engaged in something that was dangerous just because they look like the people that we're fighting against. So the Japanese internment is definitely a little bit of a stain on our country. The major legal challenge to Japanese internment comes from a guy named Fred Korematsu. That's him in both of those pictures on the side there. He was a young man in 1944 when he decided to, in 1942, when he decided to defy the order and stay in San Leandro, California. He had an Italian-American girlfriend and he stayed with her. And when he was found to be in California after the date that was set for removal, he was arrested and thrown in jail. And he sues the U.S. government on the basis that his rights as a citizen, his 14th Amendment rights, have been violated. And the case makes its way up to the Supreme Court. It's heard in 44 and the verdict's issued in 45, just like a month or so before the end of the war. And in 1945, what the Supreme Court decides is that, yes, that this is technically a violation of due process and of the 14th Amendment, but at war, the needs of the military to provide security for the country outweigh your individual rights to civil liberties. Technically, Korematsu versus the United States has actually never been overturned by the Supreme Court. In the 1980s, the United States government apologizes for Japanese internments to President Reagan, and that's when they start to pay reparations to people who were in the camps at some point or another. Some of you guys might be familiar maybe with comedian George Takei from the Star Trek and basically all of the internet. He's a really good example of somebody who was in the camps when he was young, and he talks about it. He's got several, if you are interested, you Google him. There's several very good interviews that he's given about that, and made a play, the whole thing. And he's one of the people, for example, who is eligible to receive reparations still. And then in the 1990s, early in the 1990s, they're going to have a lower court vacate Korematsu's conviction so that he's no longer like a felon, basically, legally. But the Supreme Court itself never directly overturns Korematsu, so it's still what we call good law, which is a phrase that we use for Supreme Court cases that are on the books and are considered like accurate interpretations of the Constitution. And so it's still technically out there. We don't, obviously, in general, we don't cite it very approvingly, the Korematsu decision, but it has recently come up, with some of the things that are in the news about travel bans and things of that nature. So Korematsu is an interesting and still arguably somewhat controversial decision by the Supreme Court. A couple of other home front type things. It will on occasion ask you about the American response to the Holocaust, which was very minimal. We really either didn't know about it or didn't care to know about it, perhaps more accurately. We were certainly aware that the camps existed. Right? It's hard not to, you fly over camps, you can see that there's camps there, but the conditions inside were largely unknown, like I said, until liberation, until we ended the war. A couple of, just some kind of like random little things here at the end. So one of the other groups that experiences some, hard to say benefit exactly, but some certainly recognition from World War II are the Navajo. The U.S. starting in World War I had taken to trying to use people who spoke a relatively unique language, like they use like the Comanche a little bit in the Assiniboine, and then even people from the Basque region in Europe. And then they sort of land on the Navajo in World War II to use as code talkers or to use their language to communicate with another native language speaker in a code that then becomes almost impossible to decipher. So that's the Navajo code talkers if you run into them. Last group of people that we need to touch in on a little bit are women. Just like with pretty much every war, the World War II does offer a lot more opportunities for women to take wartime jobs. Unlike other wars, though, and significant and important, World War II is the first war where women can actually join the military. So when you look at women who were like nurses in World War I, they weren't nurses for the Army, they were nurses for the Red Cross or for some other like volunteer or private organization. In World War II, however, you have actual like female Army nurses who have, ranks and they're, whatever, Sergeant, Laura Jones or whatever the case might be. We see groups like the WASPs, the Women's Air Force Service Pilots. That's a group of them there who were trained to fly at non-combat, carrying troops and supplies and things of that nature. The Navy had a version of this that they called WAVES, and the Army had WACS, W-A-C-S, so Women's Air Force, Army, I don't remember what the C stands for. Basically, all of the branches had some version of this service that allowed women to become non-combat members of the military, and this is the first time that we've seen that, so it's pretty important. At home, we see a big emphasis on women taking wartime jobs, but not just like nursing wartime jobs or sort of more typically gender role female wartime jobs, but some like more intense and industrial jobs as well. The very much symbol of this is the propaganda figure Rosie the Riveter. This is the classic Rosie the Riveter image right here, which I'm sure looks familiar to all of you. This is Rosie the Riveter is not a real person, just to get that off the table. So propaganda figure, right? Advertising figure, like, I don't know, Mr. Clean or the Jolly Green Giant or somebody like that. She was used to encourage women to take sort of like traditionally maybe non-feminine jobs. Or if you riveting, like a rivet is a metal connection that you make between plates of metal. So you hold a rivet gun in much the same way. This is a rivet gun on this lady's lap right here. Hold it in much the same way that you would hold a nail gun, and it requires some strength. There's some kickback. You have to have some, some guns, as it were, to wield a rivet gun. So this idea of feminine strength very trumpeted during the war, and then very rolled back after the war itself. The 1950s, when we hit them, are going to be one of the most conservative decades gender role-wise in American history. So it was controversial. Not everybody was a fan of this. There were a lot of social scientists who thought that this was like the beginning of the breakdown of the American family, and our kids are going to be running amok and I don't know, dancing to rock and roll on the street corners, all of those awful, horrible things that you guys do in your free time. There was a lot of concern about that, a lot of pearl clutching about the state of the American family. Last little section of this note set deals with the aftermath of the war. This is all stuff that's also going to come up a little bit at the beginning of the next unit when we start to talk about the Cold War. Most of this looks at the transition from war to Cold War. So I'm just going to kind of skim lightly over a few things that you might need to know for this test. And then some of this will come up in some more depth at the beginning of next unit. Okay, so World War II, by almost any measure, is the deadliest single event in human history. And that may sound like I am exaggerating, but I'm very much not. A lot of people dead in where you look at civilian deaths or military deaths are combined. The image that you're looking at up here, every single little icon that's on here, all the different little flags and the little people and the stars, every single one of those represents 100,000 people dead. And this is just Europe. So take a sec to assimilate that. That is a tremendous amount of people. The flags represent military deaths. So if you look, you might not even notice, look at this huge clump. That's all Soviet military deaths in the Eastern Front that we mentioned. All of the skulls are civilian deaths, so general people killed mostly by bombing raids. And then, of course, the stars represent Jewish deaths in the Holocaust, largely in concentration camps or by death squads, a variety. If you take a look at where the American deaths are, this is mostly D-Day right here, and then also that campaign through Italy, in that kind of boot of Italy. So that's where we see that having about 300,000 Americans killed, or casualties, excuse me. Here's the Asian equivalent. The war between Japan and China was definitely the deadliest part of the war here. And so you can see these are a couple of different flags representing the growing Chinese Communist Army, and then the nationalist government of China. An insane amount of civilian deaths here. These are deaths by the atomic bomb. So after by disease, bombing between the atomic bomb droppings and then the bombing raids in Tokyo, etc. And then American and Japanese military deaths. This sort of represents just in the Pacific in general. If we try to combine that, this is it's hard to come up with statistics because not all countries kept very good numbers. But men in war, battle deaths, and wounded. I just want to highlight a couple of these. If you take a look at the Soviet Union, we don't even know exactly how many people fought, but just sheer battle deaths alone, it's over 6 million. And if you scan up and down the list here, you'll see that is by far the most of any country participating in the war. And then wounded casualties, 14 million. So combined, we don't even know how many men fought, but already we know that it's more casualties than any other country on here. China also has really, really high casualty numbers, as does Germany. Right? And then the other country that sees some pretty significant deaths is, Japan right there, of course. Good. And so partially as a result of just this tremendous amount of death that accompanies this war, we're going to see something that we've never really done before on a world scale, and that is that we're going to hold international military tribunals or courts to punish people for war crimes. And by people, of course, we mean people who lost the war, not people who won the war. So there's going to be a series of them in Nuremberg, Germany, that are going to try high-profile Nazis, high-ranking Nazis who didn't commit suicide. A lot of the heads of concentration camps and people who were high up in Hitler's government. Several are going to be sentenced to death. Others sentenced to life in prison. It's a fairly serious military tribunals. They also happened in Tokyo too, largely against Japanese soldiers who were involved in atrocities in China. So I mentioned the rape of Nanking way back towards the beginning of these notes. A lot of soldiers who were involved in that were tried for war crimes, the Bataan Death March, right, some of the other things like that. So it's the first time we've ever really done this, and it establishes the precedent that saying, I was just following orders, isn't good enough. That's not an excuse for some of the level of death and atrocity that are committed during World War II. So that's a new worldwide precedent we haven't really seen before. After the war, the United States is basically looking to do three things. We are looking to build some sort of stable, international security system, right? We want to find a way to keep the world, not to end war entirely, but somewhat keep the world relatively safe. We want to create a relatively stable global economy. And we also are looking to, again, this is from the U.S.'s perspective, to try to stem or slow the growth of communist military and ideological influence as much as humanly possible around the globe. The first two of those seem like something we might be able to work with our allies on. The third one, obviously, is going to bring us into pretty direct conflict with one of our major allies, and that is the Soviet Union. So I mentioned already that there's a series of wartime conferences. Here's some of the other names. We already talked about Yalta and Potsdam down here at the bottom. Earlier in the war, the ones that dealt more with like wartime strategy, like what are we going to do? How are we going to pursue this fight? Are Casablanca and Tehran. Tehran will come up on occasion because that's the first place that the United Nations is agreed to, and Casablanca is like the first major strategy meeting between the three big countries. But usually it's Yalta and Potsdam that we already talked about that come up in terms of these. There's also a whole other set of conferences. These, if you notice, mostly happen kind of in Europe or surrounding European, sort of Turkey and kind of the surrounding areas, Iran, obviously. There's a series that happen more sort of centered around the United States, though, and those are conferences that deal more with kind of, okay, what's the world going to look like after the war? So most of these surround either the creation of the United Nations, as at Moscow, Tehran, and then especially these last two, or the creation of some of these like world economic agencies that we're going to set up, like the IMF. The last two that are on, pardon me, I lied. The middle two in here, Bretton Woods and Dumbarton Oaks, those are probably the two most important that are on here. Both of those are in the United States. The Dumbarton Oaks is in D.C. and Bretton Woods is in San Francisco. I think that's correct. But they're both in like United States areas or in territories. The San Francisco Charter, San Francisco, conference where the UN Charter was finalized, happened only days after Roosevelt's death. So I don't know if you can see this headline down here. So Roosevelt dead, and then here, security meet in Frisco will not be delayed. So that's this one right there. So while the war is underway, we're trying to sort of put together or build structures that will allow for a post-war world that is in some way better or improved. Of all of these agencies, the one you need to know the most about is the United Nations. It's obviously a huge deal, still a very important part of the world community today. It's set up to be kind of like a world court or a world congress. Every member nation that joins has one vote in the General Assembly. And the idea is, like the League of Nations, right, that this is going to be a place where countries can come and like work out differences, in a way that doesn't lead to war. The big difference, the thing that the United Nations has that the League of Nations didn't, is the ability to call up an army from its member states. As you might know, this is something that's kind of going on right now. So the United Nations decides to take action if they say that somebody is, for example, illegally violating the borders of another country. They have the ability to ask the members of the United Nations to form a coalition army to enforce these sort of new world norms. And that's exactly what we're going to see happen in Korea for the first time. The United Nations governing body is called the Security Council, and all of the allied nations are given and still have today permanent membership on the Security Council and also veto power over any action that the UN might take. So you see that's the US, the Soviet Union, Great Britain, France, and China. And this is going to become a little controversial after China's communist revolution in '49. And then there's also originally 6 and today 10 rotating members, just everybody in the General Assembly. So at any given time, you might have Mozambique or Guatemala or any of the other major or minor countries of the world might be on the Security Council at any given time. If you take a look at those members of the Security Council and you think, wait a minute, the U.S. and the Soviet Union on the Security Council together, able to veto each other's, actions during the Cold War, how did that work? The answer is it didn't a lot of times. The Soviet Union is going to spend some years boycotting the UN. They don't go, so that helps us out a little. Like that's why Korea happens. But in general, there's going to be some tension, to say the least, on the Security Council once the Cold War is underway. A big part of what the UN is going to commit to fighting for is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That is my personal favorite, Eleanor Roosevelt there, holding the copy. She was instrumental in the writing of the document. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights is basically a giant Bill of Rights for the world. It says things like, free elections, and that people have freedom of religion, and freedom of expression, and freedom of marriage. It's a very interesting and inspirational document. It's well worth a look. And it's what the United Nations tries to uphold. They certainly don't always succeed, but it is a big part of the United Nations Charter. A couple other major organizations founded in the wake of World War II, the IMF and World Bank, both have at their heart this goal of creating sort of a stable world economy. Both of these still exist today, although their functions have shifted over the years. The IMF is what, like when you look at how much yen is a US dollar worth or whatever, that's the IMF does a lot of that. The World Bank is essentially a loan institution that developing nations can apply to for loans to build infrastructure projects and things of that nature. So we're kind of globalization, right, as we know it today in terms of global trade, etc. A lot of that really starts in these years right after World War II. We're going to do some redrawing of boundaries in a couple places. Really key one that's going to dominate a lot of our 20th century politics is the creation of Israel. There had been a Zionist movement for a while, since I don't know about the 19 teens or so, but the movement to create a specifically Jewish state really gains a lot of steam after the Holocaust. As you might imagine, there's sort of worldwide horror at the events, and the idea of a protected homeland, run by a Jewish government in the interest of the Jewish people is something that gains a lot of steam. And so the United States is going to be central in kind of carving out this land and naming it the country of Israel. And this is what one of the things that involves the United States in the Middle East really for the first time. That's an area of the world that we haven't talked much about yet in this class because we haven't had much involvement in it yet. And of course, the creation of Israel is going to lead to a lot of conflict in the area, that still does sometimes today. It creates a very solid ally for the United States in the Middle East, but it also creates conflicts, sort of reoccurring and kind of consistent conflicts with the various other countries in the region. Meanwhile, in Germany, we've done something that's going to have long-term consequences for Europe and for us. And we have, like I said, at Yalta, made the decision to divide Germany into 4 occupied zones. The 3 occupied by the United States zone is the green one down here, the British zone is the yellow, and then the blue is France. And those all occupy pretty well together. There's not really much of an issue there. But the eastern zone, the zone that's occupied by the Soviet Union, is going to become incorporated under a Soviet government, a communist government, and they basically aren't going to want to give that up. So we wind up with what becomes eventually the country of West Germany, comprised of the US, British, and French zones, and then what becomes the country of East Germany, which is basically the Soviet zone. So from 1945 until 1989, basically 1990, there really is no Germany. There's no country of Germany. What there is instead are 2 countries, East Germany and West Germany. That's confusing enough. But then if you notice, the capital city of Berlin is sort of smack in the middle of the Soviet sector. But the other allies didn't want the Soviets to have sole control of Berlin, because that would be like giving somebody sole control of DC, right? It's a very important traditional sort of seat of government. So inside Soviet East Germany, we also take the city of Berlin and divide that into 4 sectors as well. And what is eventually going to become a divided city. So you have this weird situation where inside East Germany, you have East Berlin, which is Soviet, and that's fine, so is East Germany. And then you have West Berlin, which is not Soviet and is allied with West Germany, almost like a little island of democracy inside a Soviet country. It's a very odd situation. That's going to lead to, among other things, the creation of the Berlin Wall in the 1960s and a variety of other conflicts. So Europe in general, by say 1946, by certainly a year after the time when the war ends, has become very clearly, although kind of quietly, bipolarized is the word that's usually used, meaning divided into 2, between Soviet-dominated or Soviet directly controlled East Europe, which is communist, right? Everything that's sort of red here is communist or communist owned by the Soviet Union. And then non-communist West Europe, which is not always democratic exactly, but sort of democratic leaning and allied with the United States. And this division in Europe is the very kind of visual sign of where we're heading towards full steam next unit, and that is the beginning of the Cold War, dominated by competition between the Soviet Union and the United States, the 2 major superpowers. Cold War is going to last from 1945 until 1991, when the Soviet Union collapses. So it's going to dominate pretty much the entire rest of the 20th century and most of the rest of this class. And that is where we will pick up the next time that we do notes, next unit. Thank you guys for your time and attention. These notes, as always, will be posted online, and I will be talking to you guys soon.